People joining us, but we'll get moving along here. Hi, good morning all. Deb Meyhoff, facilitator for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, Needs and Housing Production Technical Advisory Committee, NAPTAC. Glad you all are here this morning. As usual, we are going to launch right into the agenda because we have a lot of sort of big, meaty discussion topics to cover today. Before I do that, I'll just recap who from the state and our consultant team is here. In addition to myself, Andrea Tremblay, our subject matter expert on fair housing and housing in general, is here, and she'll be providing some background information again. Commissioner Lazo is on much needed vacation this week, so he won't be joining us today. Mari Valencia Aguilar is here to lead us through some of the discussion, as well as Celestina and Thea, our other colleague with, DLCD. And then I think I saw Mitch Anush. Yes, hi, Mitch, with Oregon Housing and Community Services. And then, of course, Ingrid Cadell, who we could not have these meetings or do anything without supporting us. If any of you need any help, please go ahead and put in the chat if you need some technical assistance. And yes, thank you. Elise Cordell is also here from OHCS. Good morning, Elise. Really glad you're here. Sorry, I missed you there. Great. Well, with that, I'm just going to get going here. Today, we are here to discuss a little bit more about fair housing in the housing production strategies and how to explore some details on that and options for how the HPS processes and reports can be pointed to support more fair and equitable outcomes, as well as affirmatively furthering fair housing. And specifically, our goals for the meeting are to consider how to more fully integrate the elements of fair housing analysis into the HPS. So local jurisdictions can develop strategies for AFFH, that's the affirmatively furthering fair housing, that fit into local context of need. And then we'll also discuss some options and trade-offs for the analytical process itself, how we might make some changes to the HPS process and analysis to make it work better for everyone and get to the conclusions and outcomes that are needed. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to, I don't know if it's Mari or Celestina, is going to frame up the racial equity framework sections that we should keep in mind today.
Thanks, Deb. Good morning, everybody. Celestina Teva, she, and they pronouns. And I have the opportunity to highlight our racial equity framework for decision-making sections 6 and 7 for us to start to pay particular attention to over the next 3 meetings starting today in May. So we've transitioned from the last set of focus areas, and just to reiterate once more, it's not to say that all of the 8 sections of the racial equity framework are not applicable to really any conversation, because for the most part they all are, but we've pulled out 2 sections to again focus on over the next 3 meetings. So I'll put voice to them, especially since it's the first meeting that we're digging into these, and I'll add a couple of notes as well. So the first one is restorative justice and fair housing issue areas for the purposes of today's conversation. And some of the questions listed are: does this rule provide restorative justice measures for the communities most burdened? If yes, what are they, those restorative justice measures? If no, what would you suggest that is within the jurisdiction of the state of Oregon? What are some other best practices or examples of restorative or transformation justice measures that would address the impact of this rule on the most burdened? These examples can be outside of the jurisdiction of DLCD, but could provide concept ideas for sharing with tribal communities, local governments, businesses, and culturally based nonprofit organizations. So while we're not looking at particular rule language just yet, though it will be fast upon us here in July, we're applying these concepts just to the discussion topics today, which is those fair housing issue areas. I'm also going to copy and paste one definition of restorative justice into the chat here. And I think from me, it will go through to everybody. And this is a definition that was provided by our equity consultant for this rulemaking process, Anita Yap with Multicultural Collaborative. So I'll put voice to that as well, as the term is, while there are a few definitions out there, it is somewhat specific in what it asks us to consider. So restorative justice works by bringing together impacted people to figure out an appropriate way to deal with the consequences of an infraction and its implications for all interested parties. The goal is to restore a healthy community by ensuring that the offender takes responsibility, that interested parties determine a proper way to make amends, and that the victim's needs are addressed. So, I think I'll just say that doing this work in this space is new for many, if not all of us, and certainly new for the industry and land use planning to really grapple with what that looks like. I ask us to push ourselves and see how close we can get to what real restorative justice might look like in this work. And the second item is we have one question for, which is accountability. And today that's accountability in fair housing issue areas. Now, this portion of the racial equity framework is actually a bit more expansive than what we're highlighting here today. And that's because our colleagues, including Thea on the call today, have a whole other tack all about the accountability process for ONA, and that's the Housing Accountability Technical Advisory Committee. So it's not to say that we can't consider some elements of accountability, but in some ways, the way that we've set up this rulemaking is we've actually pulled the heart of those questions into a different room for discussion. So the question that we are bringing in to the NAPTAC is, how does this rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? And for that, I'll offer that, especially for where we are in the rulemaking so far, we're starting to really see those overlaps between some of the housing accountability discussions and the NAPTAC discussions. So for the purposes of our conversation, we can kind of nod to the portions of this work that are covered in our sibling TAC. There was one other note I wanted to offer you all, which is just that the additional questions in the racial equity framework for decision making are more specific about what does the accountability measure look like and things like that. So that's just why we won't be highlighting those today in this space. Does anyone have any questions? Great. Back to you, Deb.
Great. Thank you so much, Celestina, for helping with that. And we'll bring those up as we begin the discussion in just a little bit. Andrea, I'm going to hand it to you in 1 second. I just wanted to clear up a couple of administrative details I missed. One is Samuel Goldberg, welcome Samuel, is sitting in today for Kathy Wild, who's not able to make meetings this week, Housing Land Advocates she's with. And most everyone else is here. We have a couple of folks missing. When we get to discussion, it would be great if as many of you as possible can turn on your cameras, especially if you're speaking. It really helps for those watching the live stream or the recording. But if you can't, that's fine. I'll help make sure you're identified for those who have to remain off camera. Okay, those are my housekeeping items. Thank you for being patient. Andrea, I'm going to hand it over to you to frame up our first discussion item about fair housing issue areas.
You bet. Thanks, Deb. Mari, we can go ahead and put up the presentation. Well, this morning's brief presentation is actually I'll say a brief overview of a lot of the materials that you've received in your packet for today. And I personally am very, 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 as the team knows, very excited to be here because we're dealing with the meat of fair housing and integrating it, ways to integrate it in the housing production strategy process. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this, about all this. So next slide. So today is this morning's celebration. You're so lucky. You get to hear from me not once, but twice this morning. The first is going to more parallel the material that was in Memo A. And then the second half is going to relate to the information that we have in the Memo B. Next slide. So there are two guiding lights you'll hear about as we talk about what this process might look like, or three, depending on how you want to count them. The first is the state laws and rules that pertain to the housing production strategy process, and anytime that fair housing or affirmatively furthering fair housing appears in that, or equity or things like that, integrating those ideas. The second kind of, I'll say, guiding light in this overall process is we look to the mothership, HUD, to figure out, they've been in this area for over 50 years, as Alan said. So we look to them because they have a lot of experience. It doesn't mean that we're stuck with what HUD does, but we look to them for some guidance. So to start out, this is what right now is in the rules. And remember, the rules were, many of you were at the table. Yes, Mary, Kyle McCurdy, I'm talking to you and a few other people here. You were at the table when these got developed in, I guess it was been about 3 or 4 years ago. And everyone knows that they were everyone's best effort at the time. Well, time's gone on, and so we've been able to think about things. And so we're sort of revisiting that. And so the first section of the rules talks about contextualized housing needs. And it's this idea of you need to look at some data to figure out what you want to do. And then also included in that, the next kind of area has to do with community engagement. What kinds of conversations do you want to have with the people in your community and in your region about what needs to be done and how to do it? And then there's this sort of black box or mysterious box, I should say, that has to do with, okay, you've got to achieve these fair and equitable housing outcomes, but it doesn't really tell you how to get there. And we've heard from people at this table, including people who are from local jurisdictions, we've heard from you that you'd like a little bit more idea about what would be acceptable, what would be prudent, what would work in that area. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And then you put all those things together and you then talk about what are the actions that your community is going to adopt to meet future housing need. Let's go on to the next slide. So again, this morning, we're going to be talking about, you know, what's in that mysterious box. Next slide. And not surprisingly, it's about identifying what fair housing issues your city might want to focus on addressing in this housing production strategy. Next slide. Because it's going to lead to actions. And I'd like to suggest there are many different ways of characterizing the actions you might take. This is one of the ways that I personally conceptualize it. So it's to have you're trying to get a better understanding of needed housing types, characteristics, and locations. So in order to take those kinds of actions, and then also what else needs to be done to remove barriers besides housing choice beyond assisting with the production of needed housing. Next slide. So let's go to the mothership. Let's go to HUD. What do they have to say on this topic? Well, this is what they have to say. These are some fair housing issue areas, the ones that they've laid out I think this is a combination of their proposed rules and their existing rules. But anyway, these are the kind of categories. So they talk about access to affordable housing opportunities. And thinking in terms of protected classes, that means, okay, who wins and who loses in terms of access to affordable housing opportunities, or access to housing opportunities that your household can afford. Who wins and who loses in the system that we have now? And then the second one is one that is one of the main reasons that the Fair Housing Act got put in place. As Alan pointed out, it's those patterns of integration and segregation. So another one is racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So if you've been to Chicago, if you've been to Newark, New Jersey, if you've been to places like that, the areas where race or ethnicity intersect with low income is very visible and very tangible. And it's an area where sometimes people end up feeling trapped. Sometimes people end up feeling that this is the greatest thing in the world. So it's a mixture, but a lot of people end up feeling trapped. So the next one is access to community assets, all the things you need in life to thrive. And then the last one is cities do an analysis of their policies and practices that impact access to fair housing. So let's go on to the next slide. So as I said, the second kind of authority point are what the OARs have to, Oregon administrative rules have to say about this topic. And this comes right out of the section dealing with fair and equitable housing outcomes. So the location of housing, compact mixed-use neighborhoods, fair housing, housing choice, affordable home ownership and rental housing, and housing options for residents experiencing homelessness. And then finally, gentrification, displacement, and housing stability. Those are the things that they've asked that communities look at. Now, again, these rules, you are in the process of talking about how to amend rules. So we're using these as starting points, but they don't have to be our ending point. Next slide. So being the audacious consultants that we are, we put together this list of draft Oregon fair housing issue areas. And I will say that we had some robust conversation among our team, which was really good, about what these mean, how to phrase them, what to include, what to make its own category versus combine into another. So on one side, you see of this slide, you see the HUD's fair housing issue areas, and you can see the correspondence with their issue areas and the first three that we're proposing. Now, when we set out to think about these fair housing issue areas, it's not just in any context. We were thinking about what is important in the context of doing Oregon Goal 10. What is relevant there, not just what's relevant generally. And so it caused us to come up with things that, are a little bit reorganized from what HUD did. And so we have fair access to housing across tenure and wealth building spectrums. And this, you might notice that we don't say specifically home ownership and rental, because as some people on the committee pointed out, there are other options that are also really important there, like co-ops, where people have a combination of both in one particular, in one situation. Academically, that's sometimes referred to as divided asset ownership. There are a variety of things, not just co-ops, that fall under that in that continuum that don't fall necessarily neatly into a binary. So we decided that patterns of integration and segregation overlaid with poverty issues equals recaps or racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty equals the second. The third is access to community assets and exposure to harms. And we are specifically, being Oregon, we have to talk about the environment and environmental justice. So we specifically are bringing in language around environmental justice. And there's a whole group of really smart and active and grounded people working on what that environmental justice bit might look like. Now, the ones in green are ones that we've lifted from the state rule that we thought are important to carry over. So displacement and housing stability were really important, and houselessness was also important. Access to compact neighborhoods, location of housing is implicit in several of these, like patterns of integration and segregation, and also fair access to community assets and exposure to harms. And we know that we also explicitly deal with housing location as one of within the overall concept of needed housing. So we're not overlooking that. It's just we felt it was so thoroughly included other places that we didn't make a special thing for it here. Then the last one is one that has to do with listening to what people in this committee have had to say. It does deal with the population rather than an issue area. But we thought that because planning, this whole process deals so much with the built environment, and the built environment is so important in terms of fair housing access for people with disabilities. It's not the only thing that's important, but it's really important for fair housing for people with disabilities that we thought we didn't want it to get lost. And so we made it its own fair housing issue area. Again, we were trying to keep this to a limited number and focus on ones that we thought it was reasonable to ask cities to look into. Okay, next slide. So again, to go back to what we were talking about, how to transform that mysterious box. Well, now we know a little bit what's inside that mysterious box. Next slide. It's an analysis of fair housing issue areas. And again, fair housing issue areas means the topics that you consider to integrate when you're trying to figure out how to integrate affirmatively furthering fair housing into what you're doing. And so again, we now have this transform box. Next slide. So, all right, that's the super big, that's kind of, we're focusing on a little piece of this overall really major Goal 10 housing production planning process. And many of you have seen this slide before. There's nothing new here, or there shouldn't be anything new or surprising here. Honestly, we're not sneaking one over on you here. Go to the next slide. So we've been talking about things that fall under the housing production strategy. We're not even talking about all the things that fall under the housing production strategy. We're talking about the things that relate to affirmatively furthering fair housing. Next slide. So, yeah, okay. So again, just sort of talking about what this process or the fair housing part of that process might look like. This is a very conceptual diagram. There are more elements that will need to be part of it. It is not sanctioned or set in stone in any way, but it's just to give you an idea of how this might flow for the purposes of discussion. I think that's enough disclaimers. you come up with the fair housing issue areas where you analyze these areas and you come up with a summary of what those impediments mean for the jurisdiction. It's not enough just to do the analysis. And then maybe you translate that into needed housing, taking into consideration what you know from the ONA housing production targets, which are broken out by income groups. And remember, needed housing, we're talking about types, characteristics, and locations. And then the third piece is you then move on to actions to address those needs. So you're talking about the production of needed housing. You're talking about impediments to housing choice. And you're also talking about the things that have to do with CFEC and probably other things having to do with density and compactness and a bunch of other different things there, but climate and environment. So those aren't things that we're going to be talking about today, but they are included in the overall process that you need to consider when you start to identify those actions. Next slide. Okay, so that's it. That's all I'm going to say for now. The second part will be dealing more with how you do that analysis. And the closing screen here is just a hot pink version or whatever color that looks like fuchsia version, because I get excited about it. Those proposed fair housing issue areas for discussion. And with that, Deb, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andre. I really appreciate that. So just to remind you all, with your agenda packet, there was 2 memos attached. One for this discussion item is the first one in the materials list, Memo A. And I just point that out to you because that also has the 6 fair housing issue areas we're talking about here with some description about how we collectively sort of made the decision about how to reorder things. And also just a reminder, this is sort of how to structure the fair housing analysis in the HPS report. We'll talk some more in the second half of this meeting about what might be included in some of that analysis. And then in future meetings, we'll be talking more deeply about how cities might go about making that translation into needed housing and some of the other steps to really actualize this. So with that, I just want to, I'll launch us into our questions. Let me frame them up just a little bit, and then let's get going. And I think, we have sort of, as we always do, sub-bullets, but let me just go ahead and frame them all up, and you all can speak to them as a whole, because everything's related here. So our real big question is, does this set of 6 fair housing issues, as we've lined out, feel like the right set of issues for communities across Oregon to be analyzing under the housing production strategy, sort of understanding what their needed housing is and how to affirmatively further fair housing and meet all the fair and equitable goals? Does this feel right? Does the conversion from the current HPS and HUD sort of structure into these 6 areas seem like the right fit for Oregon? And then, just reminder of some of those racial equity prompts that Celestina gave us in the beginning. Do these feel like the right direction to get toward restorative justice, as she posted in the chat? Thank you for doing that, by the way, as a good reminder. And then, for community representatives, those of you who aren't working in the Goal 10 process on a daily basis, I'd be curious to hear, do these issue areas resonate with you? Do they seem like anything's missing? And for others, I'd be really curious to hear more about, are these selections of these 6 issue areas clear? Do you understand them? Is there anything else we're really missing? And then drilling down just a little bit more, you'll see in the memo, there's 3 specific areas that we're hoping, if you have strong feelings one way or the other, you'll weigh in on, which is, we've made a proposal to combine fair access to rental and homeownership housing into one, to allow for that sort of spectrum of various ownership options, various rental options, and flexibility for whatever innovations may come in the future for tenure and wealth building. Another specific jump we've made is modification of the language in the anti-displacement and housing stability fair housing issue area. Currently has the word gentrification, which isn't really defined anywhere in the rule, and doesn't fully align with some of the other things. So we're trying to just be more specific with our language. Similarly, there's a proposal at the end of the memo you'll see about, right now we're characterizing these as fair access to various housing. Is it fair access? Is it fair and equitable access? Is it equitable access? It's wordsmithing, but important wordsmithing for a lot of folks, and to make sure that we're being very clear in Oregon about what our intentions are. So with that long diatribe, I will open the discussion with, are there fair housing issue areas the right ones for Oregon? Is there something you're not clear on, you'd like to change a little bit, something we've missed, and then more specifically on the alternatives? I'm going to start with Samuel. Even though you're new to this group, I know you're not new to this discussion, but please go right ahead, and then Brock and Julia, I'll get to you next.
Yeah, well, I apologize if I'm covering anything that has already been covered before in previous meetings, but I would like to see maybe a specific call out for racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence as well. I think in a lot of especially small and medium-sized jurisdictions in Oregon, the patterns of segregation cross jurisdictional boundaries, and the best way to, get restorative justice would be to kind of crack those racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence in one jurisdiction to level the playing field between, two neighboring communities that have been segregated. The area where the recap exists is probably not going to have the power to really do something about those issues in that instance. And so the burden of restorative justice is going to be on the neighboring jurisdiction that has more resources.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for opening up the discussion. Appreciate that. Brock, go ahead, please.
Yeah, as far as the 6 issue areas in Memo A, yes, I do think that's a good way to set it out. The only thing I would add, housing choice doesn't appear anywhere in the issue titles, and I'm fine if it's not in the issue title as long as it's somewhere in the actual rule language. But generally speaking, yeah, I think this is really good. I'd just like to make sure that housing choice is somewhere in the actual rule.
Great. Thank you, Brock. Good one. Yep. Julia, please.
So I'm glad Celestina brought up the restorative justice topic, since that was something I just wanted to flag as not really seeing explicitly called out in any of these. And I'm thinking in particular things like displacement mitigation. So there's a lot of preventative language, but I'm not seeing anything related to acknowledging and responding to past harms that have caused folks to be displaced previously. I'm not sure if it necessarily needs to be its own, but I do feel like, excuse me, getting over a cold. I do feel like calling that out a little more directly might be worthwhile, to just acknowledge that it's not just what is going to happen in the future, but what has happened in the past as well.
Thank you. And under that sort of affirmatively furthering, addressing past harms, I appreciate that. And that combined with sort of housing choice, I think are understandable modifications. Sorry. Mary Kyle, please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to reinforce what Sam Goldberg said about adding into this not just the concentrated areas of poverty, but the concentrated areas of wealth, and the need to break those up for a variety of reasons. Andre mentioned it or talked about it in her video. Thank you. Those videos were very useful. I like that tool. But I don't see it reflected here. And so I think that needs to be called out more because we need tools for that. And that then brings me also to the first on the fair access to housing across tenure and wealth building. I like combining those and recognizing that there are many ways in which one can occupy or own a home. But I also just want to restate that, the reality is that renting is a legitimate choice for many people at different times in their lives for a variety of reasons, flexibility in job choice, schools, et cetera, or income constraints, or that may be the way that someone is able to locate their family in one of those areas of concentrated poverty. And I think I put this on the Miro board, but I just want to, if I didn't bring your attention to it, the study by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing on rental deserts, and those are in the most exclusively detached single family high income areas. And rentals can provide a way into areas that provide a lot of assets for children growing up, et cetera. So so those are my 2 points, just to call those out more in the descriptions of them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary Kyle. I appreciate that. Alan Delatorre, please.
Thank you. Just to quickly answer the question, this feels right. It's going in the right direction. So just want to kind of confirm that. But the one thing I'd like to challenge us on, first, acknowledging that age is not a fair housing issue as it's identified. Looking at number 5, anti-displacement and housing stability, there's a kind of nuanced understanding of aging in place. And aging in place and aging in community are things that I want to challenge us to think about. And this is at any age, right? School children, older adults who need that community and social connection. What is it that we can do to maybe explicitly put aging in community as an opportunity here? Again, not about the 55 plus or 65 plus, but maintaining connections, maintaining familiarity with the services, the education, et cetera, are all critically important for people's housing stability, but also well-being. So just want to continue to see if there's a way for us to add in a little bit on that kind of maintaining community and aging in a community over time.
Great, thank you. And really thinking about housing stability in a broader context. Kim, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Someone brought up earlier housing choice. And so I'm not sure if they meant also housing options that are appropriate to the community or the community identified needs. So rental housing, that there should be a broad spectrum and a diversity of housing types, and it should be accessible if individuals, households need that. And then in terms of restorative justice, I feel that these options don't address that. And I think someone earlier, gave some ideas of how we could do that, and I agree with that. Some ways to get at that is community engagement, and then also it's just how does the community hold the process accountable for the past and into current decisions.
Yeah, thank you. And that gets at the accountability pieces as well, sort of sorting through that. Thank you so much, Kim. And thank you for adding the thoughts on not just choice, but options that are available in communities that are appropriate. Matt, welcome. Glad you're here.
Yeah, happy to be here. So I had a couple thoughts. First of all, I think generally speaking, these 6 topics are really good. I really also am grateful that that it was specifically called out for fair housing for people with disabilities in particular. I know that can be kind of hard when you think that, a lot of these issues up front, like wealth building, affordability, integration, segregation, these are issues related to fair housing for people with disabilities. So they're almost also like subtopics under this one. But I think that the fair housing issues for people with disabilities are so prevalent and it's such a dominant area of complaint that it is a good idea to make it a specific issue area for focus. And I also wanted to echo Sam's comments about thinking about concentrated areas of wealth. And I also, in terms of Alan's comments about aging and community, one thing I did want to flag, so under housing stability, is that a lot of local jurisdictions, while it's not a protected class under federal or even state law, a lot of local jurisdictions have included aging or age as a protected class characteristic. So I think, ultimately, ONA plans are supposed, the HPS plans are supposed to be specific to the needs of a locality. If a locality has identified specific protected classes that are of importance to their community, it seems like those protected classes should be considered when considering each of these 6 topic areas. In other words, I do think that what affirmatively furthering fair housing means could vary somewhat from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of what kind of local protections do they have. And I do think that jurisdictions have to consider those. It's part of their policy. It's part of their policy requirements. It's part of like the thinking about overall policy is what I'm trying to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for bringing that up. Andre, go right ahead. I know you, in prior agendas, we had the sort of matrix that included some of those other local protected classes. Andre, please.
I think the thing that I should have included here and meant to, I just forgot to, is to either include something that gave cities the option to include other areas, other fair housing issue areas relevant to them. And in other iterations of this, I included that. I just simply forgot, and our team didn't discuss. And so, by the way, I agree with a lot of the things that are being said here, but I wanted to respond particularly to Matt's suggestion here. Not that what I think really matters, because it's what you think that matters.
Thank you. And thank you, Matt, for helping us through that and bringing that up. It's a really important piece, that local context. And is your hand still up, Matt, or did you have something more to add? Okay, great. Brock, hold on. I'd like to give a little space for Garland and Tara first, since I haven't heard from them yet this morning, and I'll circle back to you, but go right ahead, Garland.
Okay, so just some thoughts on the questions here, in no particular order. First, equitable, I think, is good language. I think in the planning profession, we all struggle with like our ability to string long words together and multiple words together and create run-on sentences and paragraphs that are actually just one sentence long and all that. I'm guilty. But I think equitable does it. I'm not sure you need to add fair or any other modifying words in there. I think equitable, like, that's the word. So that's just my kind of professional opinion, but I am happy to be wrong. If someone else thinks that you need fair in there, like, I'd love to hear that, and please make that case. But where I'm landing is simpler is better. And if you're going to choose one word, that's the word. Age, Alan, thanks for bringing up age. It's always been weird to me that you can't discriminate in other ways legally, but you can ghettoize the elderly and allow them to live in places that can legally segregate them away from members of their family under a certain age and away from healthy mixed age communities. Should that situation be allowed to continue? Should we be allowed to discriminate based on age legally when we're not allowed to discriminate based on any other socio-demographic factor? Is that really the right way to structure our communities for healthy outcomes? I want to call that question. I don't think we've talked enough about it. And then finally, I really like the language around housing tenure. I think we're generally moving in the right direction. Thank you for including language about shared equity cooperatives. If I was going to make any modification, I would just want to add in some language about giving residents the right to determine their own, to have pathways for their own housing self-determination, for having decision-making authority over the place where they live, and not just being kind of a customer or a source of revenue for their landlord. And if there's any way that we could provide some language to kind of codify into the rules more ways to give agency to residents over the places where they live, I think that could produce equitable outcomes.
Thank you, Garland. And that sort of, I think, goes hand in glove with housing choice to some degree, and that might be the right place. I do want to toss it out for those of you in this discussion. If you have strong feelings about the word equitable or fair and equitable, definitely please don't be shy about chiming in. It looks like Tara put her hand down, or unless you already put it down prematurely. Okay, all right, very good. Brock, please go ahead.
Yeah, and just a question too. I think alternative A would be my preferred. And I appreciated the considerations that you put in for both of those, but just specifically because of the use of the word fair in fair housing. I think it's good to have both. I agree that equitable is the primary driver of what we're looking for here, but I think it's good to have both. I think it might be helpful to have maybe just some like base level definitions of what that is. I would start by kind of deferring to what DAS has in their kind of definitions list. I can't remember which meeting that was sent out for, but I put together just kind of some like draft definitions here. And so should I send them to Mari or Celestina if I put them in the chat?
All right, go ahead.
Mari. Okay, sounds good. I'll send them
You
to
can
you.
send it to Mari. Yeah, send it to Mari. I'm Mari. You can send it to me. And also reminder quickly that this will be available, so you can always post to or following the meeting if there's additional pieces. So yeah, send it to me, but also have that option.
Okay, sweet. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for weighing in on that, Brock. And Tara, I apologize. I misunderstood. Please go ahead, and then Samuel, I'll come back to you. You are muted. I think that might be the issue. Yeah, for some reason, you're not muted here, but we can't hear you, Tara. Okay, great. Go ahead, Samuel, and we'll come back to Tara. Hopefully we'll fix the sound here.
Yeah, I'll just comment on the language piece, because believe me, we have people every day who reach out to our organization not understanding the definition of fair housing, or bringing up issues that don't actually have to do with what is legally considered fair housing. That said, I don't think that we should drop the term fair, because it does have a specific root in the as a civil right that people have access to. I would also say that the way that affirmatively furthering fair housing has been framed at by HUD is specifically not around outcomes necessarily, but around barriers. So the main analysis is that analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So what are there barriers that are keeping people from being able to live where they choose to live? Now, I think that it's totally valuable for the state to also look at equitable outcomes, but that is the value of having both fair and equitable in the term. In the terminology, is that you can talk about what's keeping people from moving where they want to go, and what are the equitable outcomes that we are driving towards. So that's the value to having fair and equitable in the terminology.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate those insights. And I saw Matt raise his hand, but I'm going to go to Rachel first, but I'm sure we'll hear more on that.
Yeah, I was just going to pretty much say the same thing, but less eloquently than Sam. So I just want to second that, throughout other organizations and departments, fair housing is used. So just want to make sure that we keep that alignment, but also acknowledge that fair and equitable don't have the same definition.
Yeah, really good points. Thank you. So it sounds I'm hearing a buildup of fair and equitable might be the most effective way to communicate the full breadth of what we mean here. Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to be sort of echoing that sentiment that fair and equitable is a good phrasing. I think one of the other reasons for including, the word fair is that certainly I think it does call back to the Fair Housing Act to affirmatively furthering fair housing. So it's kind of a reminder that that this terminology calls back to federal law and specific, state and federal regulatory requirements around affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think the other issue with just using the word equitable or equity is that there are a lot of competing definitions of equitable and equity. And, I guess I would caution creating how we create a definition around what's equitable or what does equity mean? Because I mean, frankly, I've seen the term defined in many different jurisdictions, and oftentimes it is frankly limited to race and gender as the focus. And under the Fair Housing Act, there are a lot of other protected classes that have to be considered in addition to race and ethnicity and gender, which are certainly very important. But we also have to be thinking of the other protected classes like persons with disabilities, families, and other protected class statuses. So I think that's one reason to use that word fair in there too, is to make sure that people aren't relying on definitions of equity that are outside the Fair Housing Act.
Great. Thank you so much for the additional context, Matt. I really appreciate that. Tara, fingers crossed.
Okay, let's try this again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. I want to echo what everyone's saying about these issue areas generally being on track, and just offering some modifications to that. So thank you everyone for doing that. I would concur. Mostly I wanted to give some input on the question regarding restorative justice. As a representative from a community who just finished an HPS process and had it adopted, I can certainly say that we did a lot of community involvement and really stretched ourselves with that, with the support of DLCD and community engagement liaisons and a variety of different efforts. And it really didn't feel like a restorative justice process. I certainly believe that communities could have an approved HPS with really glossing over their history. And the institutions that we work for, the land use planning field, the public administration field isn't really set up to be experts in restorative justice or to know how to facilitate such a process. So I just want to caution us in being sensitive to what restorative justice is, and not kind of throwing around that term. And if we're going to use that term, making sure that it really we're set up to have a meaningful restorative justice process around the history of land use planning, and how we're able to use the land. So I want to call attention to that, and really if that is the intent of an HPS or that is included in the HPS, then that really should be stated outright as the guidance, and DLCD should be providing facilitators who can facilitate a restorative justice process within the community. And if that's not the intent, then maybe we need to sort of back away from framing it in that way. So I kind of posed that question to the group about, is that realistic, and is that our intent, considering how we're all working and what the foundational knowledge base is within our fields.
Thank you, Tara. I really appreciate that sort of local perspective, fresh local perspective, as well as your real thoughtfulness and how we're using or possibly intending to use restorative justice as part of this process, and whether that's realistic or not. Shannon, please go right ahead.
Thank you, and my apologies for joining late today. It's perils of being a volunteer. To speak, if I may, just a minute to fair and equitable, I really love the inclusion of both of those words. And here's why, explicitly. I think sometimes we get stuck on this idea that same is fair. And already in the ONA, we're going to have the identification of regional needs, and just something concrete that I have experience with is down payment assistance, and setting goals for making sure we're serving diverse community members through effective outreach. And there was a temptation at one moment at Oregon Housing and Community Services to set the same goal for the whole state. 40% sounds pretty good. Well, when we looked at historically in Portland, 80% of DPA had gone to BIPOC community members, so it was too low a goal. And it would have effectively ruled out whole swaths of the state from participating, who had more like 5% in the past. So making sure that we're contextualizing our goals, and I feel like the language of equitable gets to that more readily often than the language of fair. So I even think it could be like contextualized access as all of what we're talking about here. And I did want to go back to this idea of restorative justice a little bit. I actually maybe wrote an article I've never showed anyone yet based on a past conversation where I felt like restorative justice, home ownership, and shared equity home ownership were being pitted against one another. And I just like to take a moment to call out the following statement. Oftentimes, when we talk about any level of government helping to subsidize the production of home ownership opportunities, I feel like it triggers a scarcity mentality in our culture where we're like, oh, wait, the government's going to help people get wealth? Whereas historically in our nation, right, the government has not had too many qualms, frankly, right, about taking wealth through eminent domain, through redlining, through disparate access to credit, all kinds of things, sundown laws in Oregon. We've been good at that. Not this group, not these people, but as a nation, government has used those skills, right? But when we start to talk about the converse, it's like, well, there's only so much to go around. While that might be true today, it needs to not be true forever, right? And I'm just going to say it, like the city of Portland, for example, if they can subsidize the Ritz-Carlton and build a really cool pedestrian bridge, maybe they can both invest in permanently affordable entry-level home ownership opportunities and restorative justice home ownership. We need to do both of those things. And it's not a zero-sum either or. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm seeing some love for your statements there. Really appreciate you bringing those forward. And I'm going to conclude our discussion of the first part here, but want to just acknowledge, I so appreciate all of you digging into the restorative justice piece and being really honest and thoughtful about how we could or should move forward. And hearing quite a bit of support for the fair housing issue areas to frame analysis. So with that sort of awkward pivot, we're going to move on to the pieces of analysis. But the conversation we just had is also instructive for this next piece. I'm going to hand it over to Andre for a very short line out for us on this piece.
Okay, Mari, let's hit it here. Okay, next slide. So let's launch into Memo B. And boy, was that a great discussion. And if I kept looking down, it was because I was taking notes on the things that people said so that I can think about them more. That's my way of listening and honoring statements, is to take notes. Memo B, next slide. So we're going to talk about the process for fair housing issue area analysis. And when you're talking about a process, what you're trying to do is understand those issues, how you're going to analyze them and how they apply to your community. Next slide. So one of the things that you're going to want to do, of course, is look at qualitative and quantitative data. And this is just a list of ideas. It's not necessarily, I'm not recommending, or we're not putting out a prescribed list. It's just where you might go to find information. I keep talking about local and state fair housing plans because they aren't referred to very much in the existing HPSs that have come in this past year. They could have just not been mentioned, or it could be that they were not thought relevant or no one thought to include them, or in bigger cities, the process of developing different plans can be siloed. So there could be a lot of underlying reasons, but we really want to encourage you to look at those because it's also good to know what other people are doing. And then there are the standard areas that people know about. A lot of people, as part of this group, have said, well, we've already covered some of this ground. And so, yes, you don't need to cover it again. Refer to those prior studies, refer to the qualitative work. City of Gresham in particular, I heard you say you did a lot of that. Yes, use it. Decide what you need to refresh, or maybe there's something you want to dive deeper into. Okay, interviews, focus groups, surveys. You will also have information coming from the state of Oregon, that housing production dashboard, your allocations and targets. And you will also have things like equity indicators and other state tools and information. Next slide. So, in my opinion, while it's important to show your work, most of us took math somewhere along the way, and the teacher liked you to show your work. And to me, looking at the numbers and all like that shows your thinking process. But to me, the most important thing is, what are the conclusions that you reach? Okay, you looked at all this stuff, and I, reading that stuff, may come to a very different conclusion. What's relevant is, what did the city decide? And I mean, what did you decide that are the important issues within that particular issue area? So refining ONA needed housing production targets. These are all things that you might be doing, but also thinking about it in the context of, what does this mean for needed housing? But also, just developing housing doesn't really remove all these barriers. What other things does my city need to do to solve it? And who can we enlist to help? And so the format of all this, and that's something you're going to be addressing. Next slide. Okay, that's it. That's all I have to say. We're ready for the discussion.
Actually, thank you, Andre. We are, as you all probably noted in the agenda, we also had a little placeholder in here to bring in some thoughts that arose in yesterday's RAC meeting, and there are some thoughts that are worth bringing into this. So I'm going to hand it over to Mari to sort of recap that and frame that up for us before we get into discussion.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for the space. And yes, some of you all, the recap of some of the things that we're lifting up today might be familiar because you were all with us in the RAC. Some of you were with us in the RAC meeting yesterday, and so, but want to lift it here. Andre just talked about, the second piece of the next step of what happens after what we just discussed, right? A local government has their fair housing issue areas, or they're conducting an analysis. Then what do you do with that? And how do you respond to your action plan under your housing production strategy? And so that really was kind of the crux of our discussion with the RAC. We lifted that up and said, this important step of between the analysis and then the actions, that important step of drawing conclusions and thinking about how a local government can consider addressing the issues that they find through the analysis, prioritizing and ensuring that when they have a solid HPS, they feel like it demonstrates kind of the efficacy of the strategy itself, the report itself. And we posed that to the RAC. We said, essentially, what can DLCD, what can the department do to better support this step in selecting and prioritizing and eventually demonstrating that an HPS has addressed their needed housing and their fair housing issues. And so what we heard was a multitude of things. So I won't offer all of them, but I'm just gonna offer some of the things that rise to the top. We heard, let's see here on my notes. We heard a lot of notes around support from the state in various ways, recognizing that the analysis is complex, and then also drawing conclusions is complex. And so a major theme that we took away from that discussion is more support generally would be helpful. And some specifics that we heard pertain to the HPS menu. Lots of support for that as a good first step in supporting local governments in kind of seeing the universe of ways to respond to issues, but also has an opportunity to be refined. And a suggestion that was offered was maybe tagging some of the issues on the ground that they identified through their analysis with specific strategies. So essentially, this is an issue, and these are potential strategies that could actually respond to those particular issues. There was also interest in the state kind of uplifting strategies or actions that advance equitable outcomes for local governments to use, but also doing some research at the national level and bringing some best practices to as models for local governments to consider and possibly lean on. In terms of prioritization of strategies, the opinions are wide. I don't think we landed anywhere, but we did have a multitude on one side. Some felt that prioritization of strategies in the HPS needs to remain in the hands of the local governments. And then there was the opposite, where some lean towards maybe DLCD should offer some support in that regard. And the in-betweens were some in-betweens kind of fell along the lines of suggestions to consider priorities or prioritization that DLCD could do, being towards the largest gap in the issues from the issue analysis. Or specifically focusing on affordability, especially at the lower income levels, and maybe prioritizing those actions or policies that would address that specific issue. And then lastly, because I want to get you all to the discussion, is there was a lot of feedback on the importance of the analysis that needed to draw conclusions. So lots of specific recommendations about things to add to the analysis or things to focus in the analysis, and critical like items to focus in on, like mapping and geographic areas. But also a call that flexibility in that analysis is important, because there's lots of challenges that local governments face: staff capacity, resources, et cetera. And the more in-depth analysis, the bigger the lift. And not all local governments have a big staff, a dedicated planning staff, let alone dedicated housing planners to do that. So really kind of pointing out this delicate balance between the analysis and the best to that important piece of drawing conclusions. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Deb. It's a lot that I offered to you all, so please feel free to lean into any and all that I said in the second part of the discussion.
Yeah, so in the last 17-ish minutes here, we'd like to just sort of touch base on, what sort of analysis would be helpful for is most helpful for local jurisdictions to reach those conclusions, to get them toward strategies. And then there were these sort of differing opinions on how local jurisdictions should be prioritizing their HPS strategies. That's, what are you going to do about your fair housing issue areas, for instance? Some saying the state should have, sort of a minimum threshold of strategies that need to be prioritized. Others said it's, every community is different. It should be way more flexible than that. I'm giving some sort of extreme ends. So if you have thoughts on specific analyses that would be helpful, things you think would really help local jurisdictions reach conclusions to get to strategies. Right now, the HPS rules sort of have people go through a lot of analysis, have them select strategies, but as Andre pointed out, there's this mysterious step in the middle of how are they reaching a conclusion that sends them toward a strategy? What does the analysis mean? So, okay, please, anyone wish to jump in and take a stab? I'm so appreciative of you, Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, this is going to be a stab, truly a stab here.
Great.
But I think that the most difficult thing we're looking at from the data perspective with accessible housing is that there is no kind of consistent approach to understanding what our current stock is. So how do we identify the need before we develop the production strategies without knowing what exists? And the American Housing Survey gives us a proxy, that Harvard gives us a proxy. Those are decent, but there's other information we need to know about local housing stock that's still a black box with respect to accessibility. So for instance, can we look at permit records? But the limitations of permit records are going to be a barrier. Can we look at federal policy and how that's influenced or impacted the development of elevated buildings and type C units, right? Again, a proxy measure, but not the be all end all for understanding accessible units. How do we understand how modifications have happened through individuals in non-permitted areas? And so without understanding where the data are to identify the need, how can we develop a production strategy for that? And it's imperfect. I can tell you after looking at literature and thinking about this, there's no silver bullet to the accessible housing stock. It just needs to be our best approach. But I think the state should be giving that guidance around how this can be identified. And in my opinion, we should overshoot the need, because the outcome of having more accessible housing is good for everyone. So it's not like we're causing a problem by creating more accessible housing. So let's err on the side of overproduction rather than just barely meeting an unknown need. So again, my stab.
Thank you, and appreciate that, and appreciate thoughts on the state providing some guidance and clarity on where communities might look for that sort of information locally, and thinking about proxies. I'm going to jump to Ted since we haven't heard from him yet, and then I'll come back to you, Garland. Go ahead, Ted.
Thank you, Deb. I wanted to pick up on what Alan was pointing out. He mentioned data on what our current housing stock is, and I was thinking about the other side of this, and what is the need. I know that in the ONA target setting process, there's been a lot of discussion about needs for different income groups. I'm wondering if DLCD staff can clarify if there'll also be target information for disability status, race and ethnicity, which there's now some requirements that we forecast that at the regional scale, but I'm not sure if that then flows into local target setting.
Good question. Thank you. Marty, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I can respond, but I wonder if I might want to invite my colleague Celestina too, who's been kind of more in depth on the kind of methodology and equity indicator discussions. So, but to your question, Ted, I mean, the data pieces that Alan is talking about on accessibility or just equity indices and indicators are currently under the purview of OHCS, and that's still a discussion that's unfolding. But it is an intention to have that data available at the state level to be offered at the local level. So it is there. And kind of what Alan was saying, the data is imperfect. So what that looks like, we're still kind of in the midst of that. In terms of target setting, the target is really associated with the production of units. So the ONA will, the methodology does include kind of the allocation of need over a 20-year period, and organized by affordability bracket. That becomes that target. But beyond that local contextualization of race and ethnicity, etc., that is still in the hands of the local level. But that dashboard I was talking about could be a tool to help with that contextualization. So I'll hand this off to Celestina if you'd like to offer anything there. But also, hopefully, I responded to your questions.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I asked the question also, keeping in mind, I think what Andrea was saying earlier, that this is ultimately about removing impediments. And so, maybe it's okay that we don't have every bit of data, and that our focus is on removing impediments to the extent we see that they exist.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I could add, thank you, Mari, that was all accurate, is that the equity indicators, and maybe we might be able to paste them in the chat here, the legislatively directed equity indicators are not housing unit counts. So they're not in that same way that we have like an actual target for a jurisdiction, but they are intended to get at these questions, including accessibility need. That being said, I'll reiterate that we have the same data issues at the state level that the local governments have. So short answer is in progress. It probably will be a number of iterations of all government levels sorting out how to make those indicators as meaningful and actionable as possible.
Thank you, Celestina. I'm going to move us along here, and know also that we'll be continuing conversation next week on sort of needed housing translation, and it's going to touch on some of these topics about who we're planning for and how to convert that. We have a little less than 10 minutes. Garland, please go ahead.
Okay, just a quick plug for using HUD CHAS data to identify areas of concentrated poverty, and in particular areas of high cost burden by race, income, tenure, and other demographic lenses, or alternatively, identify concentrated areas of high income and low cost burden. This can be used to identify specific geographic areas that need special care. However, it takes hours of processing to be able to pull the raw data and analyze it for use, and special skills such as R are very helpful in this process. So if the state could pre-process this data and make it available to local jurisdictions, that might help to increase data access.
Thank you, Garland. Celestina, did you want to tag on to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer that I appreciate that, Garland. And if anyone else has thoughts that they want to add about the equity indicators or the data behind the dashboard, that the best way to do that would either be to connect with OHCS directly, or if for some reason there's a barrier there, you could email DLCD staff and we'll forward it on to OHCS. But for the purposes of this meeting, we'll just have to stay with the questions that we have here.
And Elise nodding her head. Elise, maybe you could, or someone could put the proper email address for OHCS. I don't know if that's you, Elise, or someone else, but Celestina or Mari, hopefully you can put that.
It's historically been me, but we just got like a new ONA specific email address that I will see, so it doesn't just get lost in my email. So I'll forward that, and I'll just note that we'll be having some data specific equity indicators engagement later in the month and in June. So for folks who want to chat about that, yeah, send an email my way, and I'll give that to the chat so you guys can post that.
Thank you for the reminder of that, and we'll make sure everyone here also gets the notice for the equity indicators engagement. Okay, Samuel, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think related to that, at a minimum, we should probably be using the HUD AFFH tools. So school proficiency, job proximity, labor market, transit trips, low transportation cost, poverty, environmental health, and publicly supported housing. And I think that the geographical concentration of all of those things are important things to consider. One consistent problem that I've noticed coming up is that in a lot of jurisdictions, the most heavily burdened or underserved populations are also ones that are not statistically significant, ones that don't always show up on traditional measures. So that's another limitation that maybe is going to need more contextualized data or qualitative data, I guess, to get at that. And last thing, because I know we're running short on time, as far as I think that the state needs to maybe have a clearer measure of what constitutes equity, because in the housing production strategies that we've seen so far, clearly even on things like home ownership versus rental rates, cities have taken very different approaches on what they think constitutes equity. Beaverton went in a direction that said that their equity focus was on closing the home ownership gap. But I would say it was probably at the expense of renters. I know DLCD disagrees with me. Other cities have focused more on equity within renters versus home ownership. So having a clear guidance on what that means from the state, I think, is important.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Shannon, please.
Thank you. I am thinking of the HUD Consolidated Action Plan, which I've spent more time with, and I'm not a data expert, but I see what it looks to me like a cross-referencing there between poverty levels, race and ethnicity, and household size. Those just seem to me like important factors to consider together. And I think that just a general theme that's running through this whole conversation is the importance of specificity, right? Where we can see if there's a crosswalk between, let's just say in a certain county, right? If you're Native American, you are much more likely to be very low income, and that might suggest some things about the kinds of appropriate housing being specific. That if we can help municipalities to think about really targeted responses, and we can create room here in the housing production strategy for, we see gaps here, we're going to try to address them here, because I think it's going to take more than removing barriers. I think it's going to take targeted investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Shannon, and specific ideas about how that might happen. Brock, please.
Yeah, and just to clarify, we're talking about the kind of like right-hand column of this crosswalk comparison questions.
Ruh-roh. Are you looking at memo A?
It was one of the other meeting materials, but it was like the AFFH crosswalk.
Oh, right. I am not sure if that's it specifically. Mari or Celestina, can you, or Andre, can someone offer some guidance there?
I think we've ended up being responsive to some of the RAC comments that Mari raised here, which aren't specifically, related to the crosswalk. The crosswalk does show the HPS rules, so we're certainly talking about the HPS rules. If you're asking Shannon about the crosswalk that Shannon was referencing, it sounded to me like that was maybe in the consolidated action plan, but I'm not certain.
No, yeah, just for the purpose of this question, the two things that I would just note there, one, the housing cost burden, initially it says pay income for housing, and then that's for the cost burden, and then severely cost burden, it just says rent. I just want to make sure that we're looking at both rent and home ownership housing burden, because there is a really stark number of people who are homeowners who still, pay 30 to 50% or more of their take-home income towards their housing costs each year. So I just want to make sure that both of those are considered. The other one that I just had a thought about was, how does your city's profile of protected classes compare to that of your county or region? And I don't know if that's based on like this table of like which cities consider which extra protected classes, beyond what the state does, or whether that's data about, I guess, like demographic breakdown from that sense. The thing that I'm thinking just here is more of a scheduling piece. If we have cities doing these on different intervals, especially for those first cities that are doing it, it would require a lot of cross coordination in that first round to say like, hey, I know you guys aren't doing your HPS yet, but you're in our region. And then those cities having to do that work earlier than they would expect and have to dedicate extra resources to that they weren't planning. So I think if that's kind of the intent, is more of the, what does your demographic breakdown look like? I would say maybe have that kick in, or the comparison to other cities in the region, maybe have that comparison part kick in like, mid-cycle or second update to the HPS, just so that we have, everybody on the same page with an initial base level of data, and then go from there.
I appreciate that, Brock, and appreciate sorry, there was I just lost it out of my mind. There was another comment about sort of data and timing, but that's gone now. Matt, please go ahead, and then I'm gonna end us pretty soon here.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Basically, I was going to say that, I understand that OHCS is creating statewide measures for what the equity indicators will be. But another thing I think local jurisdictions might want to keep in mind is where there's going to be quantitative data, like vacuums, for example, around like different types of accessibility units. I think it might be a good idea for DLCD, OHCS to think about what's the other guidance that can be given to local jurisdictions when dealing with that kind of a data vacuum, because some jurisdictions might just be too small to have data available for like what are the different types of units available in their jurisdiction. And OHCS might have trouble getting at that data themselves, but maybe there are other methods to get at it, like the more quantitative approaches of focus groups, talking to people in the community, that should be part of the HPS process. And I think it is part of the HPS process to do that kind of local outreach. So part of it is, yes, OHCS is supposed to create these equity indicators, but I do think that local jurisdictions are going to need to develop information in the absence of perfect quantitative data.
Thank you for that. And I think I even heard, I know the thought I wanted to bring forward again was even when there is, well, no data is perfect, but more perfect data, some of the protected classes are so small in some of the smaller communities that they're just not showing up. And so I think that qualitative data can help bring those out as well. Planners and those doing this work know where to look, or should know where to look. And it sounds like DLCD might be able to give them some additional guidance on how to uncover community members that are around but not showing up in data. Okay. We have 2 minutes. Thank you all so much. I know there's more to talk about this, but this has been really fruitful conversation. Before we conclude, I do want to check back in on our sort of racial equity framework questions. I really appreciate the restorative justice conversation, the sort of cautions about pitfalls, also ideas about how that could be more fully explored in the HPS process, but mindfully and meaningfully explored. I heard a little bit about accountability measures around racial equity. I'd be curious to know if anyone else heard anything in particular in the discussion today around racial equity you'd like to contribute. Or disappointments. Okay, very good. I did, just to sort of conclude our discussion, I did feel we'll again have a place for you to add notes to the Mirror Board discussion notes, and you can take issue with the statement I'm about to make if that's the case. I heard pretty strong consensus that the fair housing issue areas are hitting the right note, There are some specifics about how those are described that you all gave us really important information on housing choice, housing stability, concentrated wealth, some of these other things within those that we need to be really clear on in rule. I didn't hear anyone sort of balking at those, but please let me know if I didn't hear from you for a reason, or we just didn't hear about it this morning. And then some really good advice on how to address some of the alternatives, and sort of I would call this a starting place for some of the analysis and kind of what tools might be needed and what tools DLCD needs to clarify and help provide more direction on. Mari, Celestina, Andre, anything more to add before I close us out 1 minute late?
Wonderful conversation. I learned from you all. Thank you for bringing your areas of expertise to this. It's all relevant. Thank you.
And I mean, my appreciation too for the discussion, but also kind of flagging you all that the Miro board that Celestina was typing on will also be available. So just flagging it as an opportunity to continue to engage in this discussion, especially if you didn't have time today or want to expand on anything, please do so. I'll be sending that out in the next couple of days. With that, I think, thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
Yes, thank you all. And we have a couple of follow-up items. We'll be in touch with some of you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.